Well, if you didn't pull your Bibles out yet, please do and turn to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. The family of Abraham is first introduced to us at the end of chapter 11 in the genealogies of the descendants of Noah, and specifically from the son of Noah, Terah. You start looking in verse 27, you see these genealogies listed, and if you look down at verse 31, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son's Abram's wife. And they went forth together from the Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. And as we begin to see the story of Abraham or Abram, we go into what Taylor just read for us, which is one of the more notable passages in Genesis. In fact, I think we still do, and most of the time we teach our young children to memorize at least the idea behind these three verses. We make them very brief, right? We funnel them down. We say things like, what were the three promises to Abraham? And the answer to that, obviously, is land, nation, and seed. But before we get into that, what I want to ask you to think about is, what do we know about Abram prior to those three promises given? I think growing up and reading this text, maybe I, as a young person, made a lot of assumptions about Abraham prior to Genesis chapter 12. But when you really think about what we know, there's a lot of questions we can't answer but are worthy to be thought of in this way. For instance, was Abram polytheistic? Did he only serve Yahweh? Did he serve Yahweh at all? We know that God, Yahweh, what we have called Jehovah, comes to Abram in Genesis chapter 12, and he tells him what to do and the conditions and blessings that will follow. We do not know the relationship that Abram had. By the way, if you'll think a couple of generations later, when Jacob sins, actually Isaac sins to get a wife for Jacob, he sends back to his kinsman. And later on, when Jacob is there with the kinsman, with Rachel and Leah's father, and eventually they leave, you remember what Leah does? She steals her father's gods, his images. In fact, if there's anything in the Bible that talks about perhaps the ideology that the family of Abram shared prior to Genesis 12, it would be that they are polytheistic, like most of the people of that time. They believed in a multiplicity of gods, possibly. What is important, though, is that in Genesis chapter 12, regardless of all of that, regardless of how many gods Abram served with his father Terah, regardless of how many gods he acknowledged in any way, there is this call by Yahweh that he comes to him and says, Abram, just pack up and go. And when you get there, I'll tell you. Have you ever thought about how unsettling that has to be to one's family? Wasn't that long ago that I had that transition of moving, relocation? I can tell you, if I had gone home to Duane and the kids and said, just pack up, I know where we're going, and I'll let you know when we get there, that would not have worked. There's a lot of questions, aren't there? Where are we going? What are you doing? Do we have a house? What kind of schools are there? And of course, I know that that's our modern day, but the reality is, even here, Abram has a family. Not only does he have his wife, he also has Lot, his nephew. He has servants. And yet he goes and says, we're leaving. Where are we going? I don't know. It was the one time in history that the male leader of the home could literally answer the question of, are we there yet? I don't know. And yet they come to Canaan and they settle. What is interesting about that too is what follows this command to go is these promises. Abram, if you will do this, I'm going to give you land, and I'm going to take your family, and I'm going to make it into a great nation, and your offspring are going to be a blessing to the entire world. Now, those sound like great promises, but what you need to know is Abram is about 70 years old when he gets these promises. Sarai is in her 60s, probably 60, 61, and she's barren. She has no children. Can I tell you that at 46 years old, having an infant terrifies me? I'm right, Brandon? We're past that stage. I cannot imagine. When I am 70 years old, by the way, I will want to hold babies, but I will want to send them back home when I'm done. But here God says to a barren couple in their 60s and 70s, you go where I tell you, and I'm going to make you into a nation. I have to tell you, it's one of those remarkable stories, and there are several in the Bible where God asks people to do things that from a logical and reasonable standpoint just doesn't make any sense. And yet what you learn about Abraham is one of his greatest qualities. As he is simply put, he is just a man of obedience. If you're in Genesis 12, read with me starting in verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed, and Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set to go out of the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and at the time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Here's another piece of the puzzle. He doesn't say, Abraham or Abram at this time, I'm going to give you this land. He actually says, now, here's the land I want you to settle in, but it's really not going to be yours until later when I give it to your offspring. What offspring? My wife is barren. And it is interesting that Abram finds himself in this situation where you and I probably would have a lot of doubts and a lot of questions, but what we read is that he just obeys. If you have a ribbon in your Bible, place it at Genesis and then turn over to Hebrews 11. And I want you to notice the way Hebrews describes him in Hebrews 11 starting in verse 8. Hebrews 11 and in verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Hebrews 11 again paints him as a man of faith and a man of obedience. God told him what to do, and he did it. And what's interesting is after this, do you remember those promises that God gave in chapter 12 that Taylor read for us? What happens is God seems to continually remind Abram of these promises. In chapter 15, he comes back and he talks about, here's a covenant. And by the way, here's the promises of that covenant that I've made with you. In chapter 17, he does the same thing again, and it tells us at that point that Abram is 99 years old. And at 99, God comes and reminds him of these promises, and then he says, oh, by the way, you need to be circumcised because that's going to be a sign of this covenant. When you get to chapter 17, Abram has done everything God has asked in Genesis chapter 12, and it has been almost 30 years, and Abram has not received one part of the promises. The closest thing is he's brought him to the land and says, now look around, I'll eventually give this to you. Not in your lifetime, but your descendants will get it. By the way, what's really interesting is we know that Abram and Sarai get a little bit uncomfortable. They have a few doubts because in between chapter 15 and chapter 17, where these promises are reiterated to them, is chapter 16, where's the story that they decide to take matters into their own hands. You remember that story where Sarai says, well, look, you can take my maid, Hagar, you can have a child with her, we can make an heir for us. And there we have the story of Ishmael. And that was a terrible idea. Because Abram has a son with this handmaid who you have to think that as she is carrying and then giving birth and raising his son, she now rises in his favor. And rightfully so. And now his house, because of the plan his wife came up with, is filled with strife and jealousy and anger. And by the way, one lesson we learn from this, and pay attention, is it is always a bad idea when man tries to fulfill God's plan without God. You learn that from Genesis 16. But turn over to Genesis 17, and I want you to notice this second or third time that we see these promises reiterated. Look, starting in verse 15. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her. She shall become nations, kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no. But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. Did you notice what Abraham's reaction to this is? As God comes in and says, hey, this thing with Ishmael is not the plan. Oh, he's going to become great, but my promises are going to be fulfilled through your wife Sarah. And you're going to have a son named Isaac. And Abraham, when he hears this prophecy and promise, laughs at what God has said. This laughter by Abraham is a laugh of disbelief. What do you mean I'm 100 years old? My wife is 90. How are you going to give a child to us at this age? You know what's really interesting is that the name Isaac means the son of laughter. And it is a name that God picks out after Abraham's response. And it's interesting that when you consider that we usually, when we think of laughing at the prediction of having a child, we usually think of what happens in chapter 18 with Sarah. Starting in verse 9, In chapter 18 and verse 9, they said to him, and this is when these strangers come who they entertain, who end up being messengers from God. In verse 9, they said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She's in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." And Sarah was listening at the door of the tent behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah, which, by the way, is a really nice way of saying she should not be able to have a child. So Sarah laughed to herself and said, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it and saying, "I did not laugh, for she was afraid." He said, "No, but you did laugh." Both parents in their old age, in Sarah's words, both parents who are worn out, laugh in disbelief at God's promise. But then we come to chapter 21, where now this child is born. And there is more laughter. Start reading with me in verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." And she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." By the way, this is a different laughter. This is a laughter of joy. This is a laughter not of disbelief, but of the joy of, can you believe that at 100 years old, Abraham is a father? There was one more story of laughter about Isaac. And that comes in the following verses from his older half-brother, Ishmael, who at this point is about 14 years old, by the way, who has become a problem child, it appears, and certainly is now, because there in verses 8 through 10, he laughs in a form of mocking of his younger brother, which causes Sarah to tell Abraham to send him, Ishmael, and his mother Hagar away. The son of laughter, born to parents in their old age. And all of that, by the way, leads us to what we really want to focus on this morning, which is Genesis chapter 22. Because we see a story that takes us from the laughter of joy of the arrival of an only son, promised decades earlier, finally received and realized. And yet God gives another command that now brings sorrow. Look at verses 1 and 2. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer them there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." I find it interesting that the way God starts off there is the same way, really, he started off chapter 12. Go to Moriah, and when you get to the mountain that I want you to stop at, I'll tell you. There's something else interesting in this passage. These two verses is the very first time in the Hebrew Bible that the word love is used. There in verse 2, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. To this point, there have been lots of relationships. There have been marriages. There have been parents and children. But not one time, whether it was Adam and Eve, or Adam and Eve and their children, whether it was Seth and his wife, or Noah and his wife, or Noah and his children, or even Abraham and Hagar or Sarah, not in one of those relationships does the Hebrew language ever use the word love until this passage. Go take your child whom you love. And what I want you to do is when I tell you to stop, I want you to go up on that mountain. I want you to take some rocks and stones and build an altar. And I want you to bind the only son you have, the son you love so much. I want you to bind him and lay him on wood, kill him, and burn him as an offering to me. Over the years, there have been moments my children have frustrated me greatly, especially the oldest. But I can tell you, I don't remember one time where I would have been willing to do what Abraham was asked to do. And even in those moments where I may look at my son and tell him, I'm going to kill you, that's really a 3-second threat. It leaves. It's an exaggeration. But God tells Abraham to take this child who had been promised to him, who it took 30 years of waiting and obedience to receive, this child of promise, and to kill him and offer him as a sacrifice. This blessing and these blessings you were given in Genesis chapter 12 in this story, it sure feels like God now is giving that blessing as a curse. And how does all of this add up, by the way, to the promises of God? If you take my child, the child that you said in Genesis 17, this is the child the promises will be fulfilled, and I have to kill it and offer it as a sacrifice, how are these promises fulfilled? I have to tell you that if I was asked to do this, I might have been a little bit more like Moses, who stood up to God and said, don't you remember what you said about your people? But not Abraham. In verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place which God had told him. Verse 4, on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boys will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father? And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. They traveled for 3 days, obviously carrying the supplies for a sacrifice. We have wood, we have a knife to slaughter the animal, and we have fire to offer the burnt offering. And yet at no point until here at the end does Isaac ever say, Dad, where's the lamb? I think what that tells us is we see a son who trusts his father. He trusts his father. And even when his father tells him, don't worry, Isaac, God's going to provide, Isaac doesn't argue. He trusts his father. And so we continue to read, and we will see, here starting in verse 9, that God does in fact provide. Read with me. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide, and as it is to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This place becomes named God Provides, where God provided the place for sacrifice. He provided the son that would have been sacrificed, and He provided the substitution for that son. And what is amazing in this story is that Abraham believes God. And while Abraham is not perfect, and he makes mistakes, and he even tries to manipulate things in his life to achieve things he thinks God wants. He's not a character of perfection. But if you go from Genesis 12 until now, what you see is trust in the Lord and obedience and faith that God will provide. And God did. And that would be a great story if we just stopped there this morning. About putting your faith in God and trusting God. And when you do that, God will provide what you need. But that's really not our purpose in this series that we've called The Greatest Story Ever Written, because our purpose is to see Jesus in all of these stories. So often we take some of these old stories, like this story, the story of Abraham and Isaac, and if we're not careful, we look at them in the vacuum of their context and only compartmentalize them as a child's story to be taught in Sunday school, as something that's contained in a coloring page or a felt board story. And that is great, by the way, because we want our children to learn these stories of faith and trust and obedience and deliverance and providence by God. But we also want to, as we mature, to see how they all point to the story of the Bible. The story of the Savior, the story of man's redemption, the story of reconciliation, the story of bringing us back to God. And I have to tell you, there's probably no story in the Old Testament that's easier to connect to Jesus than this one. The number of direct parallels between Abraham and Isaac and God and Jesus are overwhelming when you consider them. We're going to go through a list of them. It is lengthy. And because of time, we won't dive deeply into each of these, but you will see just how similar they are. For instance, in both stories, the father leads his son to sacrifice. Abraham takes Isaac on a 3-day journey from their home in the tent in the middle of that plain to Mount Moriah. And throughout the Gospels, we see God, the Father, leading Jesus, guiding him, counseling him every step of the way. And even prior to Jesus' arrival in the flesh, There are over 350 prophecies in the Old Testament that provided the guidance and the understanding that Jesus, this is what you're going to do. The Father led Jesus to the cross. Both sons were taken to the place of sacrifice being led by a donkey. Abraham takes with him his son Isaac, 2 servants, and a donkey, and they travel. Jesus, in places like Luke 19, that story is recorded where Jesus enters in Jerusalem 5 days before the sacrifice on the back of a donkey. Also a fulfilled prophecy. Both Isaac and Jesus are one and only sons. The Scriptures describe them that way. Both of them are descendants of Abraham. Isaac is really easy to see there. He's his son. But Matthew 1 shows us that Jesus is the seed of Abraham. Both sons are born by divine promise, in very unusual circumstances. Isaac is born to a barren woman who is in her 90s. That is unusual. That should not happen. Jesus is the complete opposite, born to a young virgin. That also should not happen. The sacrifices occur in the same geographic location. Mount Moriah will become Jerusalem, where Jesus is crucified. Both stories show that companions are left behind. Abraham says to the servants, "You stay here. Me and the boy will go. We'll worship and we'll come back to you." And Jesus' companions, they left and were behind. We see John at the cross from a distance, but the rest have all fled. In both stories, we see the sons carrying the wood. The writer of Genesis points out that Isaac carries the wood for the burnt offering, and we see Jesus being pictured carrying his cross for a period of time before a substitution is found. In both stories, the son questions the father. Isaac asks Abraham, "Where is the lamb?" We see Jesus asking questions as well, if it's at all possible. Is it possible to let this be done a different way? And in both stories, the fathers essentially give the same answer. Just trust me. And in both stories, both sons are submissive to their fathers. Willingly going, Isaac does. Willingly allowing his father to bind him and to lay him on this altar. And Jesus willingly being a sacrifice for us. In both stories, the fathers are willing to give their sons as a sacrifice. And I believe it's interesting that both fathers believe in the resurrection. And this is one of the more amazing points, and also I think difficult to understand, and one that I've struggled with. But with Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11, in verses 17 through 19, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, 'Through Isaac shall your offspring be named.' He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." The Hebrew writer tells us that Abraham even considered that if he gave up Isaac's life, the child of promise, that God would bring him back. You know why this is so amazing is this. Where have we seen anybody brought back from the dead prior to Genesis 22? In fact, the very first time that I'm aware of any kind of life being restored to a dead person is by Elijah with the widow's son in 1 Kings 17. Hundreds of years later. How is it that Abraham could be described this way in Hebrews 11 as believing that God could possibly bring back his son from death? And the only explanation I can come up with is this, that at this point in his life, Abraham fully believes and has faith in God. And God has said, this is the son that I will fulfill these blessings through. And Abraham is going to offer his son up willingly with the belief that if God has made this promise, he will keep it, even if that means I put my son to death. Not just slaying his body, but burning it, and yet God would still fulfill the promises by the point of having to bring my son back from ashes, if necessary. That's a lot of faith. And we know that God, the Father, believed in resurrection because He is the one who raised His Son. In both stories, the fathers loved their sons greatly. In both stories, the resurrection was prophesied. We don't think about that here, but quickly, because I know we're running long on time. In Genesis 22 and verse 5, what does He tell His servants? He says, we will go and we both will come back. We're both going to come back. And yet He goes to offer him up. Abraham was convinced that they would return. In both stories, the son is laid and bound to the wood. Isaac laid on wood that would burn his body. Jesus laid on wood and nailed to it. Both sons were going to be pierced. Isaac was spared. In both stories, we see sacrifice that is provided. In both stories, the sacrifice is caught up in the thorns. Both sacrifices also feature the grace of God. And it's this last point I want to take just a moment to expound upon. I don't know that we always put grace into this story because so much of it we emphasize is Abraham's faith, and we even see this story being used as an example of Abraham's faith being manifested in works. But there is tremendous grace in this story of God showing up in the worst circumstances and providing grace in the form of a ram. This is a story that shows God's goodness. And that last verse we read from Genesis 22 and verse 14, Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. It shall be provided. What is the it that is provided? It's God's grace. And what you see Abraham saying and what is pointed to is not just God's grace shown to Abraham and Isaac, but on that day, on that mount, on a day to come, grace was going to be provided when God gave up His only Son willingly and allowed Him to be the sacrifice for me. On this same mount, grace was provided for me. If you keep reading in Genesis 22, in verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. And I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heavens and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Because Abraham willingly went to slaughter his son, Because Abraham was willing to burn his son as a sacrifice to God. Because Abraham as a father offered up his only son and had such great faith that he believed God would bring his child back from death. Because Abraham believed so strongly in God and His promises, I have been blessed today because of Abraham's family. Because through Isaac, that son that Abraham was willing to offer, God brought His Son, Jesus, into this world, who gives me grace through His sacrifice in the same place. I don't know about you, but I am very grateful that Abraham had the faith to receive the promise that blessed me today. Grace has been provided to us through Jesus, and for that I am grateful.